Hey, death penalty class. Well, this is going to be the last video for the semester, and what I'm going to try to do is summarize what you've learned, hopefully, talk about death penalty opinion, and address why the death penalty persists in spite of all the problems that you've learned about, and then sort of talk about the future briefly, okay? So look, here's what you've learned. You've learned about the history of the death penalty. You've seen we have a long and sordid history with it, right? We went from executing a lot of people over time to executing less and less people. We went from a high of 199 people in the 1930s to then about 99 people in the 1990s, and now we're down to the 20s and 30s per year. So it seems like we're moving away from the death penalty. Now, a study of the history of the death penalty will teach you that that doesn't mean that we're going to keep moving away from the death penalty. One of the most vital lessons I've learned in my studies is just a single heinous crime, particularly a heinous crime against a particularly vulnerable victim like a child, will often lead to a change in public opinion and even to a change in law where the death penalty is brought back or is used more often. But we do seem to be moving away from the death penalty fairly rapidly based on things we've learned. So, what else did we learn about the death penalty? We learned that ideally it's about justice for crime victims, retribution. We also learned it's about crime prevention, ideally, by incapacitating murderers they can't kill again. And ideally, or the way it should be, is the thought of being executed should be enough to stop you from committing murder. We saw the reality that the death penalty, that is, the number of executions, are so rare relative to murder that it's illogical now to see the death penalty as providing much retribution or incapacitation or deterrence. And that's what the experts who study this for a living pretty much overwhelmingly said, right? Then we looked at the cost of the death penalty, and you saw the actual studies that the death penalty does not deter murder any more than any other sentence like prison, that it's excessively costly financially, 2 to 5 times more expensive than keeping someone in prison for life on average, right? We saw that it's a threat to the innocent, where people are innocent and convicted, sent to prison, and sometimes even convicted. Some of you wrote about that. They're sometimes executed. Some of you wrote about that you believe it's happened even recently. I actually believe that's true. It's true as well. And then we saw the significant racial biases, particularly when it comes to race of victim. So as we talked about, if you put those costs on a scale with the benefits, we have these really meager benefits. The costs seem to overwhelmingly outweigh it. And this is why I think states are moving away from it. Now, those of you who actually read the articles about why the states have abolished death penalty this century, that's why. They're saving money. They don't want to deal with the racial bias, especially when it's final. They don't want to deal with convicting the innocent, especially when it's final. And so they've moved away from it. Public support has waned. We're now seeing some of the lowest numbers we've ever seen in terms of public support for the death penalty. So you look through the slides, you'll see the death penalty is still supported by a large number of people, but it depends on how the question is asked. So for example, if you say, do you support the death penalty, you get one number. If you say, what's the appropriate punishment for someone who commits a murder, you'll get another answer. But if you give people, hold on, my phone. You would think a professor would know well enough not to call me when I'm teaching. That's what I'm doing. I'm really sorry about that. But hey, it's real life. Just pretend someone's phone went off in class. Okay? All right. Yeah. And then when people are given the option of other punishments like life without parole, they choose that, especially if the offender is required to work and provide restitution to the victim or a charity of the victim's family. So in other words, Americans choose life without parole more than they do the death penalty as an appropriate punishment. Now, yes, there's a partisan difference. You'll see Republicans tend to support the death penalty more than Democrats. That's because of political ideology. Republicans tend to be more conservative, but conservative Democrats tend to favor it as well. And Democrats tend to be more liberal, more forgiving, and there is evidence they're even more aware of the realities of the death penalty or more moved by those realities, like in terms of they're more sensitive to things like racial injustice, that sort of thing. Okay. What else? White people support it more. I think you probably have an understanding of why that might be. Men support it more. Older people tend to support it more and that sort of thing. Okay. So that's some of the data you'll see. Now we talked about the Marshall hypothesis. There is some evidence that that's true. So let me briefly summarize that. Remember Justice Marshall said in the Furman and Gregg cases, the question is not whether people support the death penalty when asked. The question is, would they support the death penalty if they knew the facts? So this led to the Marshall hypothesis that people would be less likely to support the death penalty if they knew the facts of how it's actually applied. And we find that that's true. So as people learn the facts of the death penalty and how it's applied, those problems we talked about, they're less likely to support it. However, if your support is based solely on retribution, we don't see that movement. People tend to continue to support it. And we even see some evidence that people become more ardent supporters. It's almost like, la, 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 I can't hear you, I'm going to support it no matter what. I believe in retribution, blah, blah, blah. Fine. That's their justification for it. Not sure if we fully understand why. We also see, however, that when, for example, students take a class on the death penalty, they tend to change their minds, but the longer they get away from the material, 10 years, 15 years later, they tend to revert back to their old way of thinking in terms of the death penalty because they're not thinking about the facts anymore, presumably. Okay. Now, the last thing you'll see in your notes is why the death penalty persists, and you're going to see something like 14 reasons or something like that. So I ask you to go through those and think about those. These come, number one, from what the experts say about why the death penalty persists, but they also come from a study I did of the states that abolished the death penalty and or reinstated it. And the one I want to speak about is government structure. You want to know why the death penalty is still legal in spite of all these problems? It's because of federalism. We have a federalist system of government that allows states to decide for themselves. So, unless the Supreme Court rules the death penalty unconstitutional under all circumstances, it'll continue to go. Individual state after individual state has to either decide to keep the death penalty or do away with it. Many are doing away with it. Others are keeping it but not using it. Many more are keeping it but just not using it. Some states are kind of vehemently holding on to it, and that's states like Texas, even though they're using it less and less. But the structure of our government allows states to make their own decisions on these matters. And so we're going to have these state variations in terms of number of executions we see. So what I propose is if you want to abolish the death penalty, you work at the state level, but I also suggest you simultaneously work on preventing murder. This shows people that you're not in favor of murders and you don't want murderers to get away with it. It also shows you care about victims. And further, if you reduce murder, there's a less likelihood that the death penalty will come back because there'll be no reason for it, like we see in North Carolina. We haven't used the death penalty since 2006, and we have the lowest murder rates we've ever seen in our history going back to the 1970s. Okay? Now, let me know if you have any questions. This is just a quick summary. I hope you've learned a lot in this class. You can always save these notes and use them anytime you want. All my PowerPoint stuff you can download and keep if you're interested, share with others, teach others. But if you have questions, message me, send me an email. We can Zoom. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Remember, your last assignments are due this week, and your last exam is Friday as well, so don't forget about that. All right, peace, and I'll talk to you guys soon.